The Second World War. Following the discovery of nuclear power, the United States begins the Manhattan Project in a secret arms race between the Axis and the Allies. Meanwhile, the German Nazis begin a revolutionary research and development project of their own, named Retribution. This will produce history's first long-range guided ballistic missile, the V-2. Though the less preeminent contingency within the Allied faction, the Republic of China and the Soviet Union, lack the economic and intellectual foundations for creating such next-generation weaponry, both far outcompete their English and German-speaking cousins, at least in one very key regard: human exploitation espionage. The Russian Communist KGB becomes a globe-spanning empire of secrets, while China's coming communist revolution at war's end will transform the ancient empire into not a country with intelligence services, but rather a full-blown intelligence state. Thus the stage will be set for the world war that will come after, and as its peace, the secret conflict between communist and capitalist superpowers known as the Cold War. As I've done for Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2, this will be the start of a long-form series of video essays on MGS3. I'm not sure yet the exact shape our course will take us in the coming weeks and months, but for now, I want to simply introduce MGS3's themes and wider ambitions, while contextualizing them in terms of the history of the 20th century. The 2004's Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater was a crash course on the Cold War for a generation largely born after that war ended in 1990. And though the game is primarily a spy action story, stylistically rooted as much in Japanese comics and animation as in mid-century war epics and thrillers from the West, it is the division between East and West, and how this gave way to Reunion, that the game centers around most. Ever since 1987's Metal Gear on the MSX2, Metal Gear has been a series of speculative, near-future science fiction. With MGS3, instead of focusing that speculation forward towards where the world might be going, Snake Eater redirects it backwards as one fictionalized but plausible account for how the 19th century grew into the 21st. This introduced a number of things that weren't possible before. For example, a major focus for MGS3 is on widespread changes over time. Changes not only to, say, history, but to politics, society, to values and ideologies. In this regard, MGS3 is not just, as nearly every entry has been before, philosophical, it is philological and anthropological. What I mean is, it portrays those shifts that occurred over the ages. And it does so to comment not only on the specific history of how World War II begat the Cold War, which begat the 21st century, but on human nature in any time or place. America may have attracted the greatest minds and had the biggest budget in the world, but the one thing it lacked was quality espionage and counterintelligence. To be clear, espionage is the penetration of an adversary to steal secrets. Counterintelligence, meanwhile, is the defense of your own secrets from hostile or foreign intel agencies and operators. The Soviets were such master spies they had people both inside the Manhattan Project and within the highest echelons of British intelligence by the end of the war. As a result of stolen nuclear secrets, the Soviets, who were never supposed to have the bomb, conducted their first field test of RDS-1, or First Lightning, at the soon-to-be notorious research site Semipalatinsk on August 29, 1949. One spy responsible, Klaus Fuchs, was exposed via a major U.S. signals counterintelligence program called Verona and arrested to great scandal in January 1950. Another two spies, the Rosenbergs, were implicated not long after. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953 as the first US citizens to be done so for espionage in a time of so-called peace. The public outing of Soviet spies in the US and UK came at a time when the two nations had never been closer. In early 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in a speech delivered in Fulton, Missouri, dubbed the Fraternal Association of the English-speaking peoples a special relationship, and the phrase stuck. Though once rivals, throughout the Cold War the US and UK would become practically joined at the hip. America would learn everything it could from its big brother, using such heroic World War II-era outfits from the British as the SAS and the SIS as the basis for special forces and intel agencies of their own. As a result, war was becoming in general much more secretive and precise. Though it was not until the exposure of Russian penetration in 1950 that the US and UK publicly entered the paranoia and patriotism that defined the early Cold War, what few knew was the decision to start a Cold War was actually made much earlier, and far less democratically. The name the Wise Man's Committee from MGS3 actually refers to 6 friends and ultra-elites inside Washington and Wall Street who collectively steered the course of American foreign policy in one way or another from World War II to Vietnam. These were the managers that Burnham had foretold, the true rulers in the new post-democratic, post-war, postmodern age. Although that is a bit reductive, I suppose. It's not as though democracy was totally dead, more that it needed to be managed. One of these managers, George F. Kennan, essentially planted anti-Soviet propaganda under the alias Mr. X in the publication Foreign Affairs in 1947. In his article, based on the historic and famous Long Telegram, Kennan coined a term of his own, writing that, quote, any US policy towards the Soviet Union must be long-term, firm and vigilant containment. It was this same year that President Truman declared the Truman Doctrine, which pledged to put the policy of Soviet containment into practice anywhere and everywhere. This coincided with the reformation of the World War II-era American outfit, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, into the CIA, which got to work intervening in secret and small-scale civil wars across the world, from Hungary to Korea, to fight communism. But the CIA, according to the prize-winning Legacy of Ashes, were for the first several years of its life a disaster, sending hapless recruits on suicide missions and totally failing to penetrate communist intelligence services and countries. 1949 brought a series of shockwaves the American intelligence service failed to foresee. The communist victory in China's Civil War, the Soviet achievement of the bomb, and Russia's retaliation against the Western formation of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, by turning its zone of occupation in Germany into a new state, so-called East Germany, which became a Soviet satellite state. But the biggest failure so far came in 1950 for the CIA, when the US failed to anticipate that their intervention against communist forces in Korea would be met by the new People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong with full force. Though the result was a full-blown East-West proxy war known today as the Korean War, and which has left the Korean Peninsula split in two. Officially, Truman at the time referred to the conflict merely as a police action, under the backing of the newly formed United Nations. The result of this intelligence failure would be a new US agency with a vital role to play in the years to come, the NSA, or National Security Agency. By the end of the 50s, both the arms, the spy, and the space race would be in full swing. In late 1953, US President Eisenhower gave a speech at the UN that formally established a so-called Atoms for Peace initiative, harnessing for propaganda and soft power purposes the prowess of nuclear energy. Atoms for Peace established a foundation for international cooperation on the questions of both nuclear power and nuclear arms. But the Soviets were having none of it. When the US proposed in 1955 a mutual global doctrine of open skies so that every nation was permitted to conduct aerial surveillance of each other's nuclear programs by international law, newly installed Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev said "Niet." Yet at the same time, Khrushchev continued to practice a kind of nuclear ambiguity, declaring the existence of many new and powerful Soviet intercontinental missiles while denying any independent means of verifying or counting them. Back in 1954, inventor of the Polaroid, Edwin Land, joined a US-backed effort to do something revolutionary with the rapidly advancing rocket technology. Edwin Land strapped to one of them not a nuke, but a television camera. Signing off on the project, Eisenhower sagely foretold, "One of these machines is going to be caught, and then we'll have a storm." But Richard Bissell, CIA Deputy Director for Plans at the time, saw things differently. He believed that technology, not mere human intel exploitation, was key to winning the Cold War. By 1960, the U-2 spy plane was the result. But Eisenhower, now in his last year as president, had become even more wary of not only the use of the spycraft, but of the entire CIA. Soon he would be calling the agencies a legacy of ashes. And few incidents underscored this historic criticism more than the U-2 incident that year. You'll remember that the Virtuous mission penetrates the Soviet Union via Pakistan. It was the same route taken by one Francis Gary Powers on a U-2 spy plane on May 1, 1960. En route to a northern base in Norway in the Ural Mountains, Powers was shot down by a Soviet SAM or surface-to-air missile, cutting short his planned 2,900-mile trip. Worse, and in true MGS fashion, this fiasco took place right on the eve of an important diplomatic conference between the US and USSR in Paris. With the U-2 incident, America first began to lose faith in its own leaders, as Eisenhower first denied the downed plane was for spying, only to come clean by May 11th. Khrushchev, who believed in détente or peaceful coexistence between East and West, never got a formal public apology for the incident as he demanded, and so the Soviet premier gave up working with the US until the next president came around.
You sure know a lot about movies.
As portrayed by two cinematic influences here, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey and 1968's Planet of the Apes, if there has been one enduring constant for our species all the way back to its primeval origins, back to when we still lived in lush jungles and scavenged for food, it has been war. As George Orwell wrote in 1945, in an important piece we'll return to later on, the history of civilization is largely the history of weapons. War, both as a constant and how it is particularly practiced by a given age, tells us a lot about human nature.
What kind of weapon is it? Something to do with space rockets?
No, missiles.
Same technology.
If there's a single conceit shared across this series, it's been the idea that war shapes society. War shapes our values, as much as our maps and even our tongues. Yet officially, war, or wide-scale war anyway, came to an end with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in year zero 1945, and the conclusion of World War II. What sort of power was necessary to make such a radical change to human nature, and how has that change in turn shaped the last century? From our oldest civilizations, humanity, in the absence of clear facts, has explained the world around us with myths and legends. Snake Eater sets out to be the very origin story for our modern age, a myth to explain both the world before us and the world that world had to become the one that we in living memory recognize. Our questions for now are these. How did World War II lead to peace? And how and why did the so-called peace of the Cold War mean splitting the world between East and West, as Snake Eater tells us in its opening title crawl? Lastly, how is all of this represented in MGS3 by such entities as the Philosophers, or characters like the Boss? With the preliminary groundwork now laid, let's dive in.
Early in the 20th century, the true holders of power in the United States, the Republic of China, and the newly formed Soviet Union gathered together in a secret meeting that would later be known as the Wise Men's Committee. The secret pact they formed there marked the beginning of the Philosophers.
Arguably, one can't describe a story of history without also interpreting it. In the field of international relations, for example, according to internationalrelations.com, the two competing interpretations would be liberalism and realism. Liberalism holds that peace, cooperation, political freedoms, rights, and the rule of law are all both possible and ideal. Realism, meanwhile, argues anarchy is the default condition of the international system, and thus that all actions are ultimately motivated by competitive self-interest. In MGS3, the starting point, the starting assumption, is the point of view that ultimately ideologies, however much they differ in their particulars, are broadly similar in their goals, which without fail involves the amassment of power. In this regard, MGS in general seems closer to a realist rather than a liberal outlook. But liberalism, with a lowercase l, has been the dominant political and cultural force since the early 20th century. Liberalism is enshrined in such international bodies as the United Nations, and fundamental to how societies the world over conceptualize themselves. How then does MGS3 respond to this? Through the shadowy group at the core of the game's story and themes, the Philosophers. In general, the Philosophers trace their lineage back to the American Revolution. This major world event introduced the idea of liberalism with the force of realism by proving power could be seized in revolutionary civil wars and coups, and lead to lasting and legitimate change, so long as it rode in on a wave of revolution in consciousness. Rather than lineage or tradition, the American Sons of Liberty went from peasants to kings on the basis of new ideas. In their case, being nationalism and liberalism, codified by the Industrial Revolution, colonialism, and the Enlightenment. The Philosophers in MGS3 follow the Sons of Liberty in their commitment to, as the name Philosophers conveys, enlighten the world with a self-serving, tacit ideology they and they alone control. We are told the organization was first founded in the early 20th century. The implication is that they do so following the First World War, which demonstrated that, in the modern age, the naked practice of pursuing realism or ruthless self-interest was becoming a kind of mutually assured destruction, as the technology of war became more and more efficient and horrifying. The First Great War was triggered by competing behemoths of international alliances. The Philosophers apparently aimed to end this competitive warmongering, which had left such huge swaths of the Western world in ruin, by forging a final alliance, more powerful and predominant than any other. And this of course tracks with the history of the precursor to the United Nations, the League of Nations, though neither the League nor the UN has anywhere near the power as the Philosophers are supposed to. The members of this final alliance, the Philosophers, originally called the Wise Men's Committee, were composed of delegates, if you will, from three nations: America, the Republic of China, and the Soviet Union. This feels like a direct nod to George Orwell's 1984, which depicts a world split into three empires: Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. In the Philosophers' case, each of these nations were founded on radical revolution: America's in 1776, the Soviet Union in 1917, and the Republic of China in 1912. According to the boss, the Philosophers really did begin believing in making the world a better, more peaceful place by making it one. Her father was one of the founding members, which again were known collectively as the Wise Men's Committee. The tension between liberalism and realism, then, between idealism and selfishness, is epitomized by the wise men and their gradual corruption into the Philosophers, a secret criminal conspiracy that will apparently stop at nothing to stay in power. It seems that the Wall Street crash of 1929 was a major turning point for the group. Given how much older and more powerful America was than the Soviets or the Republican Chinese, I think it's safe to assume that the Wise Men's Committee was actually built around the US as its driving force. The Wall Street crash knocked the US from its pedestal, which might have enticed the separate Soviets and Chinese to consider turning on America and taking power within the group for themselves. Desperate and all too aware of the danger of any one rival wresting control, it seems the US convinced the rest of the philosophers to amass a foolproof fund for keeping their conspiracy in power. This would be the Philosophers' legacy, estimated as of MGS3 at valuing around $100 billion, nearly $1 trillion today. That would surely be enough to win any coming war, no matter how awful or great. But this money was secretly and illicitly drained from all three mother countries' economies in MGS3. To keep such a huge stockpile of stolen money a secret, as well as keep any one member from taking it all, the legacy was laundered in small packets across banking institutions all over the world. What the philosophers did not yet anticipate, however, was the power of one thing in the New World Order they were themselves building: information. A Russian member of the group charged with overseeing the legacy engineered a method of collecting a record of where all the money was hidden on a single sheet of microfilm. When this microfilm falls into the hands of that Russian's son, Yevgeny Volgin, the events of MGS3 are instigated by secret forces within America to regain control over the philosophers and return the world to their original plan, with the US as the single predominant power. But that's enough for now of MGS3's plot, which, if you're interested in hearing more about, you can watch my mini-series that dives into the complete story here. On October 12, 1947, flying ace Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier for the first time in history. And soon enough, other hotshot American pilots like him would become, much like their Soviet counterparts like Yuri Gagarin, history's first astronauts. As for the first time since the original giant government-led R&D project, the Manhattan Project, the might of the modern state was directed not towards revolution in the means of war, but of peace. After two world wars had brought advancements in machines of murder on a scale the world had never seen, this transition towards apparently peaceful exploration of space was a welcome change. It seemed the values of liberalism were winning out. But what people largely didn't see was that in reality, far less had changed than it seemed. Realism still reared its ugly head. Whatever the revolution or dawning of a new age, the motives of those in power, it seems, never change. Remember I mentioned the Nazis' vengeance weapons like the V-2 rocket? Well, most of the scientists and engineers responsible, such as Wernher von Braun, were recruited by either the US or the USSR into applying the same principles of missile development to space rockets. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings were conducted via airplane, but now, as a peaceful competition between East and West over space rockets picked up speed, it seemed the days of living in fear over the next mass murder machine were back. The new, unthinkable, never-before-possible war weapon was a nuclear bomb launched atop a ballistic V-2-esque missile. Missiles that in principle behaved rather similarly to space rockets. When the Soviets showed off their prowess in one, it implied their prowess in the other. The peace that followed World War II was in reality no peace by any conventional sense. The war had been a total war, a war of unconditional surrenders and proxy wars, and attempts to annihilate entire peoples in civil wars en masse. The logic of that war was epitomized by these new nuclear missiles, and the only thing keeping the US and the USSR from all-out attacking each other was a threat, the threat of an assured destruction. A threat that, as the stockpiles rose and the arms race raced on, would become total, mutual. As of late 1945, only America had the bomb. It was then that British writer and polemicist George Orwell, in a newspaper article titled "You and the Atomic Bomb," penned the phrase Cold War. That article is worth discussing in more detail, as it inadvertently lays the foundation for Hideo Kojima's MGS3. Orwell writes that initially, as rumors of the nuclear weapon proliferated, it was speculated that if such technology was obtainable with relative ease, a true and barbaric revolution would come, by leveling the playing field both in international relations and politics in general, yet only by plunging the world in a permanent shroud of darkness and destruction. However, Orwell notes, so long as nuclear weapons remain the sole purview of large and wealthy nations, as then recent news reports suggested they would, Quote, "The atom bomb, far from reversing history, will simply intensify the trends apparent for a dozen years past." End quote. Orwell drew inspiration for his grim yet eerily accurate predictions about the coming post-war nuclear age from American philosopher James Burnham, who argued World War II itself represented a kind of social revolution in ways that few people appreciated. Burnham, in Orwell's words, taken from 1946, argued classical capitalism, quote, "is disappearing, but socialism is not replacing it. What is now arising is a new kind of planned, centralized society which will be neither capitalist nor, in any accepted sense of the word, democratic. The rulers of this new society will be the people who effectively control the means of production, that is, business executives, technicians, bureaucrats, and soldiers, lumped together by Burnham under the name of managers. The new managerial societies will not consist of a patchwork of small independent states, but of great superstates grouped around the main industrial centers in Europe, Asia, and America. These superstates will fight amongst themselves for the remaining uncaptured portions of the Earth, but will probably be unable to conquer one another completely. Internally, each society will be hierarchical, with an aristocracy of talent at the top and a mass of semi-slaves at the bottom." End quote. Taken from Second Thoughts on James Burnham. Orwell believed the atom bomb would be crucial to keeping Burnham's managerial revolution permanent. He ended his 1945 article by writing, "The atom bomb may rob the exploited classes and peoples of all power to revolt, and at the same time put the possessors of the bomb on a basis of military equality. Unable to conquer one another, they are likely to continue ruling the world between them, and it's difficult to see how the balance can be upset except by slow and unpredictable demographic changes." Looking at the world as a whole, the drift for many decades has been not towards anarchy, but towards the reimposition of slavery. We may be heading not for a general breakdown, but for an epoch as horribly stable as the slave empires of antiquity. James Burnham's theory has been much discussed, but few people have yet considered its ideological implications. That is, the kind of worldview, the kind of beliefs, and the social structure that would probably prevail in a state which was at once unconquerable and in a permanent state of quote-unquote Cold War with its neighbors. Had the atomic bomb turned out to be something as cheap and easily manufactured as a bicycle or an alarm clock, it might well have plunged us back into barbarism. But it might, on the other hand, have meant the end of national sovereignty and of the highly centralized police state. If, as seems to be the case, it is a rare and costly object as difficult to produce as a battleship, it is likelier to put an end to large-scale wars at the cost of prolonging indefinitely a peace that is no peace." End quote. All of this would of course be expressed in Orwell's final novel and greatest masterpiece, perhaps the greatest novel of the century, 1984. But the Cold War was not one fought merely by spies, scientists, and politicians. It also gave rise to so-called American think tanks, philosophers, you might say, who used the power of words to try and steer US policy in particular directions. It was in 1957 that the space race officially began with a terrible shock. Long assumed to be technologically second-rate, the Soviets beat America to space with the launch of the artificial satellite Sputnik 1. Many American agencies, think tanks, and government initiatives would result as the public withered with paranoia, rage, and resentment. By 1959, so-called policy experts from think tanks, like one Albert Wohlstetter, argued for not shrinking away from the prospect of technological brinkmanship with the East, but embracing it. Wohlstetter furthered what was by then a commonplace assumption, that the only way to keep peace was by a doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Of deterring the enemy from a preemptive nuclear strike by building such an advanced nuclear arsenal and infrastructure that total retaliation was guaranteed. It would be these kinds of philosophers, who played poker with the chips of the world, that Stanley Kubrick would satirize in his 1964 film and major influence on MGS3, Dr. Strangelove. With the election of President JFK, a new era was dawning in the Cold War. It is the 1960s, of course, to which MGS3 most directly relates. After the shock of Sputnik, one result was Project Mercury, a mission to put a man in space. This endeavor would involve more than 2 million personnel and require the sacrifice of several lives. Yet the Soviets would still beat the West once again to the punch when Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin rode into space 3 weeks ahead of Alan Shepard's launch in 1961. Gagarin did so on the Vostok 1 rocket, which in the MGS universe was of course built by the engineer Nikolai Stepanovich Sokolov. Involved in the American space program in MGS was, in turn, the boss. We'll discuss her story in greater detail in a future video, but for now it's important to note she would have roles to play in important events to come. In 1959, communist revolution had come to Cuba, right in the US's back door. This was at a time when more and more the CIA were beginning to resemble one of their World War II era influences, the so-called Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, the SOE. Like the SOE had in Central Europe, the CIA was now in the business worldwide of arming proxy armies, of kidnapping, torture, and wet work, meaning assassinations. All of these covert and clandestine activities would obviously influence MGS3. The CIA wanted to assassinate Fidel Castro and overthrow his revolution. Ever since a speech by Eisenhower back in 1954, the US officially believed in the domino theory, a philosophy that communist revolution in one country could trigger runaway revolutions cascading across an entire region. East and West were trying to play an old imperial game called the Spheres of Influence, but unlike in older ages, this was the era of popular coups and revolutions. That meant for the US, fighting the Soviets meant fighting proxy wars against regional powers and popular uprisings, either by sabotaging elections, killing off political leaders, or stirring up small-scale wars. This war, though, was peace, or at least what passed for it in the nuclear era, just as George Orwell with 1984 foretold. The Bay of Pigs incident refers to a CIA attempt at overthrowing Castro via an army of dissidents that they secretly armed and trained. This failed and fateful fiasco came just 5 days after the launch of Vostok 1 on April 17th to 19th, 1961. Because the US did not want to risk exposing its hand in the coup attempt, it refrained from all-out wiping out Cuba's air force. Deceived by the CIA, JFK believed that a quieter coup would suffice. But the CIA did, however, manage to wipe out half of Cuba's planes with a sneak attack. In a strange parallel with the falsified case for invading Iraq in 2003, the CIA sent a US official, in this case the US Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, to the UN with a phony story to explain these events, telling the world that the attack was the actions of a Cuban Air Force defector. Stevenson was caught unwittingly lying in public as the defector story was swiftly debunked. Fearing their true involvement was on the verge of breaking, the US backed off from its own coup plan last minute, abandoning the Cuban defectors ashore on the Bay of Pigs to their fates. If this video gets 30,000 views in the first 2 weeks, we'll return with a detailed breakdown of the biggest Cold War event for MGS3, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Until next time, boss.